Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alina Needham, and I'm with PAVRO. Thank you so much for logging in to join us today for our webinar. Today, our special guest is Karen Diedrich from Volunteer Canada. Karen has over 15 years experience managing the development of key deliverables and cross-sector partnerships to advance national strategies and initiatives. She is the Vice President of Public Engagement and Knowledge Mobilization at Volunteer Canada. Previously, she had served as the National Priority Advisor at the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. Karen has a BA in Criminology from Carleton and a professional certificate in Partnership Management from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. She currently volunteers as the Sponsorship and Partnership Lead for Hacking Health Ottawa. So today, Karen is going to be educating us on the volunteering and the Sustainable Development Goals, looking at the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that Canada and others are committed to achieving by the year 2030. We realize there's not a single goal that does not involve volunteers. Volunteers contribute to eliminating poverty, advocating for human rights, protecting the planet, and creating thriving and resilient communities. Volunteer Canada has been exploring the link between volunteer activities of Canadians and the SDGs, supported by Employment and Social Development Canada. So Karen, thank you so much for being here today, and passing the mic over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Joanne. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the invitation to present. So that folks can know what to expect today. So I'm going to give a very quick overview about Volunteer Canada, just so folks know where I'm coming from. Very quick overview about the Sustainable Development Goals, just so that everybody is on the same page about them. Why Volunteer Canada decided to take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and volunteering. A little bit of an overview of the mapping project that we undertook that looked at stats from Canada's General Social Survey on giving, volunteering, and participating, and some current initiatives that are taking place at the national level that I think are of interest, and are just really about looking at the possibilities around this concept of volunteering in the SDGs and different areas that we might be able to take it. So that will be the brief overview what we'll do. I'll make sure that there's time for questions at the end. But basically, for those of you who are not familiar with Canada, we really believe that a strong Canada is built on connected communities, right? So we believe that involved Canadians are critical to that. And so our mission is to provide national leadership and expertise to increase that participation, quality, and diversity of volunteer experiences. So we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute, to get involved, that they have a positive experience in that volunteerism, both as an organization and as an individual who's volunteering. We work with a whole bunch of different organizations across Canada. We work with a network of local volunteer centers. So Volunteer Canada was actually founded over 40 years ago by local volunteer centers, and we have evolved into Volunteer Canada. We used to be the Canadian Association of Volunteer Centers, and we still work very closely with that network. There are approximately, there's a little over 200 of those centers across the country, and we still work very closely with them. We work with volunteers. We work with a variety of nonprofit organizations, both at the community, regional, provincial, territorial, national, and national levels, and a few international as well. We work with various government departments, including Employment and Social Development, Statistics Canada, Public Safety, to name a few. We also work with businesses. We do a lot of work in the area of corporate citizenship, employer-supported volunteering, and really that evolution of corporate social responsibility and purpose-driven organizations, to see what that means in terms of integration between companies and communities. And last but not least, we also work with educational institutions, be it for research projects or exploring connections in terms of community service learning or volunteering that takes place on campuses. So we value the different experiences that we gain from working with these different organizations, and we couldn't do what we do on our own. So that is a little bit about Volunteer Canada. So I'm going to try just to get a sense. So what you see in front of you now are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to try the tech here in the chat box. So for those of you that can, I'm just curious of who's on the webinar, of who is familiar with these SDGs. So if you are familiar, can you type yes into the chat box? And if you are not, can you write no? Or if you feel you're somewhere in between, you can write sorta or whatever. So we'll just see if we can all see that. We'll just give you a second there. I don't know if we can see things. Okay, well, that was a little experiment. I can't see if anyone's put anything in there, but that's okay. Now I know what I can and can't see on the chat box. So the Sustainable Development Goals, very briefly, were developed in 2015. They are an evolution of the Millennial Development Goals from the United Nations, and there are 17 of them, as you can see here. And behind these goals, oh, sorry, I just need to click to the next one. There are 169 targets. That can be quite overwhelming, so I feel like 17 goals, it's much easier to comprehend. Oh, yay, I see a chat there. Yes, someone is familiar with them. Perfect. The Sustainable Development Goals have been adopted by over 193 or by 193 countries, including Canada. And what that means is that there is a commitment to action and there is a commitment to reporting on our progress and what we are doing towards meeting those targets, recognizing that the different targets may be of different priority for different countries. But there are 169 in there, so I'm sure there's a lot that we have to report on. And you may sometimes hear these called the global goals. Or you'll hear a lot of reference to 2030 because that is the timeline. So the timeline is that we make progress against these goals by 2030. So some of the initiatives that I'll go into, you'll see, Alliance 2030, Impact 2030, all of those things. So why look at volunteering and the Sustainable Development Goals? A few different areas came to mind that prompted us to start to look at this. One is that we wanted to raise awareness that the goals are relevant to Canadian communities. So in the past, and sometimes when something comes from the United Nations, you may not feel that it's relevant to you in the community or even to our country. Is it really about international efforts, international cooperations? What does it mean to Canadian communities? And so we really wanted to take a look to say, you know what, this matters to us and we're working towards these goals all the time. We may just not call it that. We also wanted to illustrate how volunteers are already contributing to achieving these goals in Canada. So if you think about the chart that was just there, promoting health and well-being, eliminating poverty, there are many, many organizations and many volunteers who have been working towards these goals for a long time. So illustrating how the work that we're already doing is contributing to advancing the SDGs in Canada. In addition to that, the organizations and not just the individuals, and to communicate that impact in a clear and compelling way to volunteers. So we know that the research shows that volunteers want to know the impact that they're having. They want to know the impact that they're having in their communities. And what about that impact at a global scale? So thinking about what would that mean? If we know that they want to know about the impact that they're having, if we can tie that to tie that local to that global activity, what might that mean? And in particular, for millennials who we know see themselves as global citizens. And last but not least, we wanted to identify if there were any areas where maybe we want to make a concerted effort to increase our volunteer efforts in those areas to really support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we did, gosh, I feel maybe 6 months ago, maybe a bit less than that, everything's a little bit blurry. We took a look at the statistics from the 2013 General Social Survey on Giving, Volunteering, and Participating, which are the latest stats that we had available to us on volunteerism. That survey actually was recently completed in 2018, again, and we're very much looking forward to the release of those findings at the beginning of next year. But for the meantime, the latest stats that we had access to were 2013. So that's where we started. We hosted some roundtables with a variety of organizations from different provinces, territories, nonprofits, and volunteer centers, as well as some federal departments. And you can find a summary report of what I'm going to talk about on our website at volunteer.ca/SDG. And there's also an infographic there that's a quick kind of scan if you're not interested in the detailed report. But what we did was we mapped volunteer activity against those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So starting with those volunteer stats. So these stats are from that 2013 General Social Survey. So what those stats tell us is that 44% of Canadians 15 years and older volunteer, and that equates to 12.7 million Canadian volunteers. So it's not a small number. We are quite involved. And that on average, they each give 154 hours per year. So that's just kind of the broad strokes of the data that we had been looking at. And so we wanted to get a sense from that around how did that map around the SDGs? So as an example, here's one of the SDGs and one of the organizations that we looked at. So on the left, what you see is SDG number 7 around affordable and clean energy. And what you see under that heading are some of the targets that are associated to that SDG. On the right, what you see is an organization, SOS Planète, and some of their the statements on their websites about what it is that they focus on. And we can see alignment between those targets and the work of the organization. So we started by looking at what are some of those targets, and then what does that look like in the different organizations across Canada. So that was kind of looking at it and mapping some of those organizations. We did not map every organization, but that was just a starting point to kind of say, okay, do these things align? Do they make sense? Can we see alignment in different organizations? So this is another example around SDG number 1, to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So I don't want to, I know there's a lot of text on the screen there, so I won't read it all for you. But again, just an example of how there are organizations, councils, roundtables, municipalities working together to make progress around these goals. We know that there are approximately 170,000 nonprofits in Canada, and half of those are 100% run by volunteers. So by there, you get a sense of the scope of volunteer involvement at the organizational level. But we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this. And again, going through those stats and saying, okay, how does this map? How does this map against what we're seeing? So what you see in front of you is a compilation of groupings of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So even though 169 targets is overwhelming, 17 can be as well. So what we did was we grouped them based on the goals into different categories. So on the left, you see the categories that we grouped them in: social services, education and health, development and housing, environment, law, advocacy, and politics. And on the right, you see the goals that we assigned to those different categories. So you don't need to worry about those right now, but that was a way of grouping them in a way that made sense. And as you can see, there is quite a bit of volunteer activity in social services, as well as health, education, and research. So thinking back around why would we want to look at Sustainable Development Goals and volunteering, I think this answers some of the questions and some of the reasons and helps us to paint a picture that these are relevant to Canada, that volunteers are active in moving them forward, and the organizations in which they are engaging with are part of that equation. The other question, one of the other reasons we're looking at it, was around the gaps. Might there be areas where volunteers are not as involved? And so if we look at law, advocacy, and politics, we had some theories as to why that may or may not be. Part of it might be how one defines volunteering and whether they see themselves as participating in a protest or in political activity or advocacy as volunteering itself. So the current stats capture formal volunteering for the most part. So whether people identify as that as a volunteer activity and therefore would report on it in this particular survey. The other are the laws that govern charitable activities and the risks to any type of political activity, and therefore maybe that area is a little bit lower in terms of its representation, but those were just theories and ideas, so definitely something worth investigating. The other that was a little bit of a surprise to me, I must say, until I had some conversations with folks, was those around the environment and how low that was in terms of level of engagement on those areas. I spoke with a few folks that work in the environmental sector recently through giving these presentations at different events. There was folks in the room from all over the place, and they actually, one woman was not surprised to see that it was that low. And again, discussions emerged around formal versus informal volunteering, and that sometimes maybe folks are seeing it as individual choices or promoting individual choices as how they are supporting environmental causes. So for example, choosing to recycle at home or choosing to carry your own straw with you, or so that those acts really were individual acts of people doing things in their own lives to protect the environment, not necessarily, again, through formal volunteering. So that was one theory. Others was that if people were kind of saying, okay, well, what are the environmental organizations? So if I'm thinking about organizations and they involve volunteers and they're specific to the environment, what are those organizations and how are volunteers involved? And maybe they're not as broad as we might think they are. In terms of, what comes to mind when you're thinking about volunteerism and the roles that they play across Canada. So those were some of the discussions that came up. I mean, also considering that we've grouped there 6 different goals under the environment. We didn't pull it out per goal in this particular report, but if you start to space them out that way, maybe there are some in there that have more active volunteer involvement than others. So we could even splice it down a little bit further. But all that to say that there were certainly engagement across multiple SDGs in advancing them here through volunteerism in Canada. So the other thing that we did was we spoke, as I mentioned earlier, with various stakeholders to get their thoughts on what do they think. So we hadn't actually completed the mapping yet. We just wanted to bring folks together and say, does this resonate with you? Does this concept of the Sustainable Development Goals and volunteering and importance to Canadian communities, does it resonate with you? What does it make you think of? And so during these roundtables, what we did was we started with a card game, just to put people in a different mindset, and not cards like, not poker or playing cards. But what we did was we took about 40 or so different member organizations from Volunteer Canada, and we put them on a piece of paper and we distributed those across the tables. And everybody had that grid, that first grid that you saw with all of the different SDGs on it, with all the beautiful colors. And we said, okay, not having to dig, not having to go into Google and do research, just go through the different organizations that are listed on those different pieces of paper and see if you think they align with 1, 2, 3, or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that activity in and of itself was interesting for people to kind of think and become more familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, because we certainly have seen that there isn't a high level of awareness of the SDGs. And then also realizing that for many organizations, it was around, oh, actually, is it about how they do their work, or is it about the work that they're doing? So if you are an organization, let's say you work with children and youth, but you also have a strong environmental policy in terms of you're a paperless organization. So a lot of discussions around how do you actually assess and what does that look like and what does that entail, and the layers kind of came through. Then we stepped back and we talked more broadly about, so what does this framework do? Is it helpful? Is it confusing? Is it too in-depth? Is it too high level? And as you can see there, a few folks found that it actually was a great framework for mobilizing what we're all working on together, and to look at it together to simplify seeing how the overlap is there and how we're all part. So even though we might be separate organizations, even if we're within one of the strategic directions, for example, 4 being quality education, we can see how we're part of that larger movement towards a sustainable world. So that was really seen to resonate with folks. It also could be seen, as you can see there, to reinforce the direction or mission of an organization, so that this is important to the organization, important to the community, but has that larger importance to, again, building a sustainable society. And then I'm not going to read all the quotes, but that was some of some of the general thoughts that came from those roundtables. In terms of recommendations, so what should we do with these things? So these were some of the recommendations that came up. So again, because of that lack of awareness that came up around the roundtables, I would say since we hosted these roundtables, there seems to be more and more and more awareness of the SDGs. I feel like it's really ramping up, and the more people that I talk to every time I do this presentation, it seems that there's more people in the room that seem to know about the Sustainable Development Goals. There's also been a recent call for funding around the Sustainable Development Goals from Employment and Social Development Canada, so that has piqued up some curiosity. But people wanted presentations that they could use to have those conversations with their stakeholders, their board members, their staff, their volunteers, whether it was to recreate that exercise, just to get people thinking about what they're doing in their communities or their provinces or territories around what they're doing as an organization or as a group of individuals and how that relates to this larger framework. So just a general kind of knowledge base. There was also interest in a survey so people could better understand that alignment according to their program's mission and goals so that you could be a little bit more specific. And then the appetite for asset mapping to see what multi-sectoral participants could identify kind of in the group, in private and nonprofit. So where could we see alignment around an SDG, but from different stakeholders within a community, be that companies, educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, governments. So really kind of seeing what that community looks like. So those were 3 of the recommendations that came from those roundtables. In addition to that, the collection of stories and sharing around, well, there's different ways of sharing information, and stats is one of them, and mapping and all of those things, but stories also go a long way. So how can we tell the stories about volunteering and how it supports the Sustainable Development Goals? And what could that mean for recruitment of volunteers or retention of volunteers? The idea of actually integrating the SDGs into volunteer matching software was also raised in terms of, again, seeing how what you're doing is connected to something that's larger, and convening of federal departments that engage volunteers on a more regular basis to further explore this link. So those were the recommendations from, again, that diverse group of stakeholders that we engaged with on the topic. So I'm just going to pause, and I'm not sure this is going to work, just given that the chat didn't work with the yes or the no. But these were, so as I've been talking, how can the SDGs be used to increase volunteering and giving? So that's one of the questions that has come up quite a bit, and I think some of the ideas, and please do feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box. I don't know if Joanne, if you can see them, and maybe share them with us if folks are typing things in there. But some of the ideas that have been discussed again through these different presentations and through engagement with folks through the products that we've shared is millennials in particular, and really kind of that that global consciousness that they seem to have, and seeing themselves as global citizens, and could it be used to increase volunteering amongst young Canadians? So that's been something that has been talked about, or in different ways.
Hi, Karen. Yes, so I have the chat box is open. I'm not sure. We have a comment here from someone, and it's from Mary, and she's answered by connecting the volunteer contribution to the impact it makes, or connecting to the contribution that the person makes.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, Joanne. I don't know why I can't see it, but I can't, but that's okay.
It's showing up here on mine. So, and just a word out to the group, if anybody, you know, if you have questions, comments, please feel free to put them through the chat. I can receive them, and then when we stop for Q&A, we can review that with you, Karen. So well, I'll keep track of it all.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, so absolutely. Impact is certainly something where you can show that impact to the volunteers and the organization themselves, the millennial, the recruitment, the retention, those were different ideas that came up. And then seeing how what you're doing, again, is part of that framework of the 17 SDGs. These were different comments and responses to this questions that I've received in the past.
Karen, we have another comment here, and that's that they're useful for communicating to funders and supporters who are also focused on the SDGs.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very good point. Thank you very much. And we're seeing that alignment We're seeing it in calls for proposals, not just for the government. We're also seeing it in company reports. So some companies have aligned themselves with particular SDGs that align with their corporate social responsibility efforts or with their community engagement. So if they were already working to support, for example, education, then some have transitioned to now integrating quality education SDG number 4 into their language, into their websites, and into their communication. So we're seeing it across different sectors. Great, thank you so much, everyone. So now I'm just going to highlight some initiatives that I've come across that I think are quite interesting and that, again, help us to make those connections and explore the possibilities of how the SDGs as a framework might help to advance volunteerism or other areas of those kind of 5 areas I had covered at the beginning around relevance to Canadians, work already being done, both by organizations and volunteers, and gaps and so forth. So what you see in front of you is the movement map. This was developed by the BC Council for International Cooperation. It started as a project focused exclusively in British Columbia and has since expanded to cover all of Canada. What you can see there is that they have mapped over 11,000 civil society groups across Canada who are working towards an SDG. So what does that mean? So if you go to the movement map, and I've put the URL there, it's map.bccic.ca. You don't need to do that now, it is not necessary. But if you go there, because when there's things that have mapped organizations across Canada, I don't know if you're like me, but I kind of go, oh, I wonder if they've mapped my organization or the organization that I volunteer for or the organization whose board I sit on, or we start where we're at. And so what I've done was I just went in and I did a quick shot of different areas of Ontario. So if you go into that movement map and you go into Ontario, you will see different areas where they've mapped things. And as you click into these, what I didn't do is a screenshot of what comes up when you actually click on an organization. But as you go into there, and you can also search, you don't have to search by map. It shows, so they have identified this, organization X, they have set, SDG 1 and 3 or just 1. Some have multiple, and then the contact information, the website, and a little bit of information on that, and then you can go and learn more about that organization. So that's one part of Ontario. Here's a little bit more north. Sorry, these aren't, I didn't want to go technical. I wanted to go with screenshots, so nothing could not work. But that just gives you a sense of some of the mapping that's taken place, and this is ongoing. And so I think one of the really interesting things about this is it can be quite challenging to learn about what's going on in our own areas and who's doing what and who's working on things that are relevant to us. And there are new initiatives and new organizations emerging all of the time. So what a great resource you can search by SDG, you can search by area. What a great way to find potential collaborators. What a great way to identify what is happening in your community and how you might be able to get involved. So that was I was really excited when I came across this, and they are continuing to map it. And as I spoke with the organizers to learn more about where they were going and where it had come from, I learned that a large part of this map has, in effect, been developed by volunteers. So it has evolved, and as I said, it started just with BC, but there is a huge volunteer component just to the development of this initiative in and of itself, which I thought was quite interesting as well. So this is just an example of one of the tools that are out there that really are using that framework to map civil society organizations across Canada and how we use that and what opportunities might be there for collaboration. There was mention, I think, on their first screen. No, it's not there, but if you go into the movement map, if you learn more about what they are and who they're doing, who they're mapping, I believe they're considering mapping other types of organizations, but right now it is only civil society groups. So that's just one of the initiatives that's budding right now. The other platform that might be of interest is called Alliance 2030, and this is an evolution of work done so this is an initiative of the Community Foundations of Canada and is an evolution of some of the work they did around the Canada 150 initiative. And what this does, it's a place for organizations to join. So you can be a member for free. You just join, you register who you are, and then you can post things about upcoming events or about projects you're working on. So I went onto this platform when we started the matching project, and I put up a little profile about Volunteer Canada, and I put in a little bit of information about the project. And then once the report was available, I went and uploaded it. And we had done a webinar in the past once the mapping project was released. So I went and I put that on. So it's a place to go and see and hear about what's going on across Canada, but in a bit of a different way than the map. So instead of the geography that links you to there, here you find the specific projects that are related to an SDG, but in a bit of a different way. So they're taking more of what I would call not story exactly, but more of a story-based platform in terms of project summaries, blogs, all of those different things. So I went in and I took a little look at their members. So you can download the member info as a spreadsheet, which seemed to be the quickest way to get information about their members and the mix of it there. So you can see that there's currently over 1,500 members of this Alliance 2030 platform. A little over 600 are headquartered in Ontario, and of those, their region of service is a mix of local, provincial, national, and a few international. There was maybe 2 or 3 in there. So that just gives you a sense of the scope of the platform in regards to some of the organizations in Ontario that have engaged. This is an example. So if you go in and you look at something that's there, it's a project. You can see the related goals. So this one is specific to sustainable cities and communities. You can learn more about what it is. There's contact information if you want to learn more. So it is quite transparent, and it's a great way to learn, maybe dig deeper into a project than necessarily that map. So again, very valuable, bringing together a lot of information about what's happening around the SDGs, but in a bit of a different way. This is just a little bit more about that initiative. I thought it was really interesting. It emerged from an initiative from some research done out of the University of Toronto, where it was encouraging groups of people to connect. So just that importance of connecting with each other and the mental health benefits of face-to-face contact. And in it, through this initiative, they were encouraging folks to volunteer for organizations when they were getting together. So again, just another example of how volunteerism or of civic engagement or participation in community is coming up in all different shapes and sizes, even when you're not looking for it. So I was just exploring the platform, and I came across this and I thought, oh wow, they're encouraging folks to go and work with different organizations and volunteer together in their community. So just another example of how volunteerism is kind of popping up all over the place when we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is an idea that Volunteer Canada has been exploring. So we've been kind of saying, hey, what could we do about this? How now that we know that volunteers, we thought before, but we've kind of mapped it and we're like, okay, so now we don't just think this, we really, we know this, we can look at this and say, yes, volunteers are doing this. What might we be able to do to raise awareness about that? So at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how there seems to still be limited awareness about the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, regardless of volunteering or relevance to Canada, but also about kind of those other elements that I've been talking about throughout this presentation. So we actually worked with a local college here, Algonquin College, and they have a social innovation lab that is focused on sustainable development goals. So like I said, it will start popping up everywhere. If you haven't seen it yet, you will start to see it. And so we worked with a group of students and we said, listen, we've done this research. We've figured out that, we validated some of our assumptions, and we're hearing different things from the roundtables about what people want and this way of supporting awareness. What could we do? And so we were thinking tools, and this is what they came back to us with. They came back to us with, why don't you map that for them? So don't make them do more work, which was a great idea. And I know all of us who work at a nonprofit definitely don't need more work to do. But they said, why don't you map it for them and say, hey, thank you for what you're doing. So we know about the recognition, we know about the importance of impact and saying thank you and connecting that to that impact so that we do the work and raise awareness and thank folks at the same time. So this is an example of something that we're exploring doing for Volunteer Canada members as a bit of a pilot, or even potentially for all of those 11,000 organizations on the movement map. That's kind of a longer term goal. But again, this was kind of a virtual postcard idea that both raises awareness on a few different levels and then could be shared. So this is just another example of a type of initiative that brings together volunteering, sustainable development goals, and those different elements that I had talked about at the beginning around relevance to Canada, impact that organizations are already having, impact that volunteers are already having, and maybe raising awareness about the gaps in some element. So those are some examples of the things that I have come across that I think are just kind of making me think a little bit differently about this framework, what it could mean, how it might be of assistance. You know, this is here until 2030. And I think if it works and aligns with what you do and you think that it could help to impact the work of your organization, show value of your volunteers, start a conversation around it. I hope that you find that interesting. I think we're all learning and sharing. And so I think that's part of where I'm at, is just kind of, I keep stumbling across these really cool, fun initiatives that are happening all over the place after these discussions or presentations. Folks come up to me, oh yeah, I'm doing this here. Oh, I didn't think about it. I could do that there. So I guess I just want to close. This is my final slide, so I don't have a lot more talking to do. But just on thinking about how can we share information and resources as we learn and discover these effective strategies. So if, for example, Volunteer Canada does this little thank you postcard and we raise some awareness, you know, what goes well, what didn't go well, why would something like this work, how can it easily be recreated, how can we share our learnings, and how can we share information? I think the two platforms I gave an example of are great starting points because they already exist. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, and we can connect over there. But not just because I post something doesn't mean that it's working. And so thinking about that, as well as how can volunteering be tapped into to achieve the SDGs? So how can we really consciously look at volunteering to advance Canada's commitment and include it in our reporting actually to the United Nations? So I'll just pause there in case folks have any comments on those two questions, or if you have any other questions at all, I'd be happy to discuss those now.
Karen, I have a question for you, kind of, you know, relating to both of these points, sharing information and resources about the SDGs, and, you know, developing links for each of us within our own agencies to illustrate maybe how our volunteer opportunities touch upon the SDGs. So, for example, you know, a lot of places will have the statement on their website about how they embrace the CCVI, for example, you know, to give the program that validity. So have you heard of, or do you have examples of maybe other organizations that have maybe referenced the SDGs on their web pages to maybe illustrate, hey, this is how this role connects with this link, just to help motivate people more?
I've seen it mostly to date on government or company websites. But in the presentations that I've had, I did have quite a few people that said, oh my God, it would be so easy for me just to take one of those SDG squares, the one that's relevant to me, and just stick it on my existing job description with a link or something, right? So really kind of keeping it simple. But also recognition that until people are aware of those squares and what they represent, so kind of a chicken before the egg, kind of like, you know, which one do we do first? Do we
Right.
focus on raising awareness? Is it too early just to take something like that and link it to this big UN global website? Or is it, yeah, I'll do it and I'll add a page on my website that just talks about why this is here, how this organization, you know, maybe you pull out one or two of those specific targets to say, this is, you know, our work, our mission is to do this. This directly aligns with the work of, you know, SDG number 5, target 6. And so you do a bit of that connection and awareness raising at the same time.
Okay. And is that something I'm thinking, you know, September's coming, going out in public, doing the student fairs at universities and colleges and things like that. Would that be something that might help to engage a younger demographic by taking that approach? So not so much about our agency, but in the broader view, this is how this work supports the direction of the country in this way.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great idea. And as you were talking, I thought of something and I lost it. Um, yeah, so okay, I had that moment. It'll come back to me in a second. But yes, absolutely. I think working with schools and students. So we actually had a student working with us for a few months. We have co-op students working here every once in a while, and she was studying international development. And as we were looking at this project and as we were looking at different areas, I mean, she knew these things better than any of us did. And so I think students in a variety of different um, areas of study may actually be more familiar with these than we are, depending on what they're studying. And so engaging with universities, colleges at different events is certainly a great idea.
Mhm. I mean, I know certainly a lot of information that's out there right now relating to how to engage younger people, people under 30. And one thing that's been shared is that individuals in that age group are very invested in maybe shorter term projects, but projects that have a change the world effect, right? So I can certainly see how linking the SDGs to that mindset could be beneficial to recruit. But a challenge is that, we all want to engage youth and younger volunteers to build that sustainability, but that age group seems to be interested more so in the short-term projects, right?
Yeah,
So.
I came across a new app because now there's an app for everything. But it was actually started by a woman based out of Kitchener-Waterloo, I believe, who has had quite a bit of engagement with the United Nations. And she has developed an app, I believe it is called My Effect. Um, and she's looking at basically these reward points, and she's looking at getting beyond raising awareness so that people can kind of, so it's targeted to millennials, and it's exactly what you're talking about. It's how they can show that all of these different things that they're doing, these small acts, these time limited acts, they don't, often they want to engage with different organizations at different events, and they can keep track of all of that. And that My Effect app aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. So she's kind of gamified the SDGs for a millennial audience. So I'm not 100, I literally just came across this last week. So I have no opinion on it other than, wow, it's kind of cool, and I'm going to go check it out. But again, an Ontario-based entrepreneur who had experience working with United Nations. She is quite young herself, so understands that millennial mindset. I believe she is in the millennial grouping,
Mhm.
but really that gamification of not even volunteering, but like, yes, volunteering, but just that of the almost the framework and social good.
Mhm. That might be another webinar. Maybe download that app and show us how to use it.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
have a question here from a participant. She's asking, can you talk about the funding available?
Sure. I know. I wonder if I can figure out what I can do to. I can send the link after because sometimes it's not always obvious. But currently there is an open call for funding. Again, it's through Employment and Social Development Canada. So I think if you Google ESDC or Employment and Social Development Canada, and then they have a funding area on their landing page, and it lists kind of all their current open calls. So they have one right now for Sustainable Development Goals, and its focus really is on enhancing multi-stakeholder efforts around advancing what they call the 2030 agenda. So again, that 2030 in there, raising awareness and support about it in Canada, ensuring that no one's left behind. So really making sure that we're considering marginalized different groups. And then I think there's another element, I just can't remember what it is, but it's an open call. It does not have a deadline. So you can apply anytime, and it's, I believe, up to a maximum of $100,000 for a 12-month period.
Wow.
Yeah. And I believe there is another call for funding expected to come out again from ESDC later this month. No, later next month. Sorry, this month is almost gone. So I think it's by the end of July. I know that's all I know about that one.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's a start, right? There's a
Yeah.
start to work towards something. So.
And I've noticed a lot of, so for example, UPS, a lot of foundations, company foundations. I don't know as much for I've just been looking at different things in different areas, but foundations you will see, UPS is one that comes to mind right now, just because if you go into one of their latest report, the SDGs are there. So even if it's a company CSR thing, there's also often a foundation attached to it, and I've been seeing the SDGs integrated into that.
Great. So the floor is open. If anyone else out there has any questions, please type it in the chat box and we can review that with Karen. The last slide that's up is her contact info at her office in Volunteer Canada. And I'm assuming if anyone has any questions or maybe thinks of something in the middle of the night or something like that, they can reach out to you that way as well, Karen, with direct questions or?
Yes, absolutely. If you see something that you think is really cool and you want to share it, or you have a question or a thought or an idea, please reach out anytime, and happy to talk. As you can tell, we're still exploring. We're early days in this as well. We're trying to wrap our head around, what does this mean? What does this look like? How can we, in what ways does this align with what we're trying to do in terms of that increasing participation, quality, and diversity of volunteer experiences? So, we really see some opportunity there around impact, around collaboration, around recognizing and celebrating the role that volunteers have in kind of these what do they call them? These wicked problems, these big challenges. And so we're really excited about the potential, but really, would welcome the opportunity to speak with folks about their ideas, their thoughts, or things that they're seeing that they think are kind of new and up and coming, or are worth giving a shot.
Excellent. And that's I guess my question, which from what I'm gathering is our last question. But it's always nice to do these webinars or go to a conference, go to a workshop, and then you walk away with your head buzzing a bit with new ideas and things. Is there a direct next step action that you might recommend for those of us on the webinar today as a way to take a step towards making this a bit more live at our own individual agencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would recommend that you have this conversation a little bit about that kind of opening. You could, have your mission, have your vision in front of you, and have a bit of a conversation with the folks at your organization and your volunteers. Do a bit of work ahead of time and look at the framework. You don't need to become an expert in the Sustainable Development Goals. I've been working with them for a while. I am no expert. I went to a recent screening exercise where I had to screen an organization and see if they were aligned with sustainable cities and communities, and I realized how little I knew about that area. So constant learning, but I'd say step one is go onto the United Nations website and just do a bit of digging and get a little bit familiar with it. You're going to be attracted to the one that you think is most aligned with your organization, so maybe look at that and then bring that back to your leadership team or your volunteers and have that conversation and kind of say, hey, what do you think about this? Have you heard about this? What could this mean? How, is there an initiative, a small initiative? Is there an event where you could kind of facilitate that conversation with some of your stakeholders, and just again start to explore and engage your community, your staff, your volunteers, and the people that you're working with to see what they think. And I mean, the best ideas have come from the conversations I've had with people. They haven't come from my little brain. They've come from hearing the different ideas and seeing what people are doing and how we can connect those dots.
Great, excellent. So with that, Karen, we thank you very much for enlightening and educating us a bit more on the SDGs and letting us know how we can be more effective in our own roles to put this into practice. So thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And please do, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or ideas. Always interested in discussing this.
Great. All right, well, have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the webinar. We'll see you in a couple of months with our next one, more details to follow. Have a great day, everybody.